Hi everyone, welcome. In today's stream, I'm going to be talking about learning security fundamentals. So this is now our second stream in the Learn AppSec with Me series. So I am just kind of continuing my exploration into AppSec. I'm excited if y'all are here for a second week, a second session with me to kind of explore this as I go along as well. I will say just a kind of, message getting started that we are going to be talking about some of the recommended security fundamentals to include and just to be mindful of in the applications that you're building and working on, collaborating on. These are, I think, fairly straightforward tips that I would say, but it's super helpful just to be mindful of these things. So I'm going to go through a few tips that I've seen highly recommended, and I think I 100% agree with them. So I'm curious if you all do as well, or what other tips that you might think of along the way. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. If you have any questions or want to chat, please just go ahead and drop a message in. I am monitoring my chat over here. So I will respond to everything that comes in. And that's about it. I guess I should just give an introduction about myself real quick. I am Megan Lewis, and I am a senior cloud advocate. I focus on emerging technologies, so you might have seen me talking about other tech topics before. I am a big fan of lots of different technologies. I think one of the great things about my job is I get to kind of explore and learn a lot and talk about things that I'm learning, which is really cool. So I am super excited about cybersecurity and kind of focusing on application security as the kind of first step in my security tour. But that is about it for now. If anyone wants to say hello and why they're interested in security or anything like that, feel free to drop it in the chat. All right. So let's go ahead and jump into things. And I will just have another preface by saying that we are going to kind of focus on slides today. I think in the next set of sessions that we have, we are going to get into a lot more like hands-on and like specific examples and use cases that we can look through. But this is still a little bit high level today. So let's get to chatting about fundamentals. Not going to really get into very specific tools and practices. Again, that's going to be the next 4 weeks, but it's super important to understand fundamentals and what can be done to protect your application from information and data breaches. All right, so I want to start out with a recap of the CIA triad. So I did cover this in the first stream, and if you have been doing any of your own, exploration and diving into information security, application security, you might be very familiar with this CIA triad where we have confidentiality, availability, and integrity. So with confidentiality, it's all around keeping secrets safe. And it's really important to just really protect personal information and make sure that it's kept secure. This kind of part of the triangle always really has to do with data breaches that are just becoming more and more common. So confidentiality can be, a really common threat that we see, but that's also very important to continue to understand how to keep data and personal information secure. Next up is integrity. If we go over to the other side of the triangle, and integrity ensures accuracy. So really the important thing here is that data is correct and accurate. Data is current, so all those things, current, correct, accurate. And that your data isn't being altered in any way. It's all about really having trust in the data that you have being presented to you, to your users, and that it is correct. And then finally, there is availability. So availability is making sure that your system is resilient. So systems should generally always be available. I think it's important to always keep the lights running on businesses. So availability is something that typically everyone really strives to have as close to 100% availability as possible, understanding that sometimes there's going to be need for downtime to do necessary upgrades, but that's the most that you want to have downtime for. You don't want to have downtime because you're experiencing a denial of service attack, for example. So it's just important to keep that in mind. And I think this is a really good foundation itself to really kind of remember for information security. These are all of kind of the possible threats. They all fall into one of these three buckets, and how you can do your best to kind of keep data safe and kind of keep it up to these three standards. All right, so I'm going to focus on 10 tips to enforce security fundamentals that can be done throughout the development process and just throughout really the application lifecycle in general. So, of course, this series is all about going on a learning journey with me and building an understanding of AppSec together. So really kind of want to enforce some of these foundational topics before we get into more specifics. As I am learning, I will say that I didn't come up with these tips on my own. I think, like I stated in the beginning, these are things that I totally agree with and I think are solid when you're thinking about how to have secure applications. But I will credit many of the suggestions today that I was looking at when I was reading Tanya Janka's Alice and Bob Learn Application Security. So that is who I'm going to credit for a number of tips today. I think these tips are more widely kind of accepted throughout the application security field. So just calling that out. I want to thank all the application security experts for providing a lot of great resources to learn from, because I think I'm definitely ingesting all that material, and it's just good to talk about and keep all this in mind again. So let's get into it. First is really about protecting against breaches. So breaches are going to be the most common security threat. We're continuing to see new breaches all the time. I think in last week's example, I was sharing the latest Facebook data breach that had hit, 500 million customers this week. I know there's been a lot of news around the LinkedIn data breach. So, I mean, it's really continuing to hit companies hard. Even those that you think might be really secure are all, possible victims, I guess, of data breaches. So data breaches have really kind of caused a lot of organizations to become more GDPR compliant. So GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. I think that this is cool for a couple reasons. I think GDPR, there's a kind of a lot that you need to do to become compliant, but it's really all around better protecting customers' data. So I think a couple things to call out around this compliance is that you would have to notify users of data collection. You notify users if there's a breach. So, they should know right away. I think this is a very good practice. You typically will need to find ways to anonymize or pseudonymize users' data so that if there is a breach, ideally you have to do more work to kind of figure out the identity of the users. So that's kind of a huge point. And I think one other thing to call out here is that with GDPR, you have to give customers a right to have their data erased. So let's say that you stop using a service, you can request to have your data erased if it is GDPR compliant. So that can be really important. Say there's a breach years later after you stopped using a service and your information is still there. So that's always something to be aware of. And that was a cool reminder to myself, because I think I don't ever request that my data be erased, but maybe that's a good thing to be doing. So yeah, I think that's the kind of some of the highlights of GDPR. Other things to be aware of protecting against breaches is really just have the mindset that breaches are always possible. So you want to do your best to kind of design the application to anticipate breaches, understanding that okay, if my application were to get breached, how can I make it as difficult as possible to this hacker to really get a lot of sensitive information about my user? So if I find ways to anonymize my data, or just make it really complicated to like understand the data, then that's something to keep in mind. But kind of have the mindset that breaches can happen. And then I think the last thing to call out here is have thorough monitoring and logging. I will say that this is probably going to apply to maybe quite a few tips as we go through this, but thorough monitoring and logging is going to do a lot of, it's going to be super helpful to understand if there's any unauthorized access or any kind of suspicious behavior that may happen on your system. So logging and monitoring are going to be huge to your application, and just kind of have that constantly running and looking out for strange things that can happen. So next tip, second tip, you want to figure out how to protect against insider threats. So insider threats, might not be as common as external threats, things like breaches, for example, but still definitely something to consider. I think there's also, different categories of insider threats that you need to consider. Some of them, you can do a good job of really kind of locking it down and making sure that these threats are not happening, absolutely, but some of them might be a little bit, you might be able to find ways to be more proactive about this happening. So when I kind of think about that, for example, let's start with malicious threats. So someone's actively trying to do harm. And this is an employee, like for example, let's say someone is really unhappy. They just got fired. It could be like a salesperson that, is taking customer data with them as they're on their way out the door. Similarly, like a developer taking code that they no longer, have access to, and they can like give that code to a competitor or something. So there's lots of different threats. Even someone trying to take down the application to make it be unavailable. So there's just lots of different things that can possibly go wrong. And I think you can do a better job of preventing some of that than others. I think it's as far as like information stealing and exposing information, that might be a little bit hard. That might be a little bit harder to prevent than someone, for example, trying to take down an application. There should be a lot of safeguards in place that don't allow you to just completely crash an app. But yeah, I think malicious threats in general are probably going to be a little bit more scary of people actively trying to do insider threats and harm the application. Accidental threats, on the other hand, are always going to be a risk. Someone is unaware of the harm that they are causing here. It might involve situations where you're using an application incorrectly. Perhaps you're even sharing information openly about the application or maybe about customers, and not really, being mindful of it. I don't know. That maybe is something that can be more malicious if you are trying to share information that you know that you shouldn't or is confidential. But there's kind of lots of different ways that this can happen here. I think probably the best thing that you can do there, and probably that employers are really good at, is trying to find is trying to really, I guess, create a lot of opportunities where there's training so you know exactly how to use the application and things that you should and should not do. There's probably, privacy training where you shouldn't, you're advised or you're strongly advised to not share any information or, customer data with outside people, outside of your organization. So accidental threats, I think that's a kind of category that's likely always going to be easier to catch and to try to lock that down, because these are people who want to do well and don't mean to kind of cause insider threats, but just something else to be aware of there. All right. So next, third, I can't do that over there. Third is to focus on implementing many layers of security. So with this concept that I was reading about called defense in depth, it's important to have multiple layers of security in case one is not enough. So every layer that you add is obviously going to provide more security. Just like if you put on another coat, you're going to be warmer, let's say, for example, it's going to be harder to kind of get to expose cold to your body, for example. So it's probably just not enough to consider, let's say, safe coding practices, which I think is really important. That's kind of where my mind always jumps to first is like how I can be, better about keeping security in mind when I'm coding, when I'm testing, when I'm designing, any of those steps. But generally, again, you want to maybe be more mindful of how you can kind of consider all the points where your application can be accessed and think about how you can have more security from each one of these points. And I think, again, there's like probably different angles that you can look at here. My mind kind of first goes to like, a developer mindset, let's say, like as I'm developing what it can do, but there's probably even more than that you have to think about. For example, like who else can access the application? So maybe even thinking back to the last example and kind of preventing insider threats, let's say, how can like you provide thorough resources and training to employees so that they are not kind of misusing the software and not being, one of the layers that can go wrong here in your secure application. You can even think about, network security. I think that's another one that comes up that, maybe is not always on my top of mind for me. But just what are all the ways that you can do to kind of lock down the application from any external threats? All right, so next tip number 4, is giving the least privilege possible. So this is a really good practice to really focus on only giving users as much permission as they need, nothing more. Can be less, like typically as little as possible is kind of what you want to go with, because you can build in setting controls to make it easy to turn off internal access or have ways, kind of official ways for people to go ahead and actually like grant access for specific actions or something. And that might be even, a better way to do this. So if someone grants access, then you probably have logs and kind of records of them granting access, for example. So that is something to consider. And only when necessary should privileges be granted. So yes, again, like maybe having an official way to actually ask for information, and then maybe you only have have this kind of privileged access for a short amount of time, and then you don't have permission to do that anymore. So this is kind of all in the spirit of only leaving kind of the most power in a few people's hands, assuming that if kind of the normal user got breached, then it would be a lot less harmful than like the admin getting breached. So I think that this is a really good point, and probably when you're building any application, I think you're kind of considering how this works both like, internally and externally for your application. I think it kind of goes both ways as like even the employees and the people working on the app, and kind of how that can be controlled for whatever it is you're building as well, if that makes sense. All right, so I think this next tip, that's tip number 5, is all around obscuring data. So I think I was kind of referencing this earlier in the first tip when just thinking about data breaches are possible and like what can you do to just like anticipate a data breach. And obscuring data, I think is something that you definitely want to do. Just thinking about if someone does gain access to your application, how can you make your data the most hard to understand? How can you make things be more hidden? I think a good practice here that we see commonly is being able to encode data so that it's hard to reverse engineer. So if anyone does get access to the code, some unauthorized person just like hacks into your code base, for example, that it should be not really apparent exactly what they're looking for. I think it's kind of cool to think about, and something that I've spent some time thinking about is open source versus private software applications. I think I've worked on a fair number of both. I've probably done a lot more work in recent years on open source applications, where you obviously assume like these are not secure. So you are typically probably building something where you want to share it with other people. That is the point. You want others to contribute. But it's probably not something that you're worried about being like copied, for example, from other people, or you're not necessarily maybe the most aware of like all the security vulnerabilities that you could be having within this app, or you're not even worried about like hackers, really doing something wrong with the code, because I think the code is open for people to explore how they want. So I think one maybe misconception that can happen here is if you are an open source developer, you're building an open source application, for example, is that you might think like, oh, if it is open, then I'm going to have people come and like look for vulnerabilities in my application and try to find ways to make it better, which I don't think is true. I don't think people are necessarily doing that work for free. So maybe maybe it's important if you do have an open source to consider like having a maintainer full time that does that, not depending on the community, but just something to keep into consideration. So, I mean, the whole opposite spectrum of that would be private software where, you want to have control over the IP. You don't want anyone to be able to kind of copy or even see those implementation details. So, yeah, I just thought this was an interesting example. Why obscure data rather than encrypt data is a question from Maurice F3. Yeah, I mean, I guess obscure can, that can be like a number of definitions, right? Obscure is, it could be making things kind of like harder to read, so that can, I think an example there can be encryption. It can also be making things private, so like they're actually really just harder to access completely. Obscure, I guess the whole like thinking about the definition is just making it harder to understand. Like, pretty much is what I was getting at. Um, but I think, yeah, those are still just options. For example, I think, for example, if you have a private repository that you're working out of, you might not really be worrying so much about like why or how even you need to encrypt your data, but that's definitely an option to consider. And good question. Thank you for the questions. If there are any more, keep them coming. If there are like any more examples that folks want to chat about, we can do that too. And there's another question. What is best practice? Where should we encrypt before saving to SQL, or encrypt on API side, or just enough with HTTPS and SSL? Concerned with index search performance on SQL side. Yeah, so that's a good question. I think, yeah, there's probably a number of places where you can encrypt. Where I have been thinking about this in particular is thinking about where your data can be exposed, right? So like, even if it is a private application, this is top of mind for me, like having just done one of those capture the flag competitions where like I'm using an application that I already know has lots of vulnerabilities, but I'm going to spend a lot of time trying to like just look into the developer tools, inspect a lot of things, see what I can get from just the developer tools, whatever I can find in my browser. So I might see some plain text data in there that I shouldn't. So you might even want to encrypt some of that can be exposed. Doesn't necessarily have to be from the database, but that's probably also something that's super top of mind. Is looking for ways to get information from the database. So say, for example, I am able to get some kind of secret data, like some account number or something. That might be even something that if you're storing it, you might want to store in an encrypted way. So that's kind of the way that I approach thinking about what is best practice to encrypt. Like, if someone is actively trying to get into your system, what kind of information can they get easily just from poking around? And if they were to get that information, like, you want it to be encrypted or you want it to be obscured in a way where it means nothing to them. I hope that made sense. We can chat about that more. I think that's a really interesting topic. And I mean, there's even like multiple ways that you can encrypt data. So that's like kind of a whole nother scenario as well. All right. So next, let's talk about reducing attack surface. I think I don't know, this is one of my favorite tips. I think, what are we on tip 6, perhaps? So with reducing attack surface, this is like always kind of keeping in mind how you can keep your application as lean as possible. So basically, you want to remove anything from your application that is not required. Like, that's kind of just like the general case, but probably more best practices here are doing things like keeping code clean and simple. So I think always, like, whenever you code an app, you want to think about what is kind of the most simple implementation that you can have of a function, for example. How can you keep everything really kind of clear? You're just removing any unnecessary code, essentially. I think it's really important to also only have production ready code in production. So this is probably really clear, I think, especially for most kind of like proper development processes. You wouldn't have code ready in production before it's meant to be there. You would have it kind of on a separate feature branch or something like that, but just really important just to not have anything that's like half done, or just even something that you don't feel good about, something that hasn't gone through proper testing or any kind of other verification, say from like a security team or something. I would say it's just really important to not let things slip. And removing or like, yeah, updating any dependencies that need to be updated or removed, basically. I think what's interesting here is I was reading a fact, and I think this is totally true, is that modern applications are typically, maybe only made up of like 30% original code. And you can say that the other 70% is all like dependencies that have been introduced, third-party dependencies. And, that's kind of a whole nother thing to keep in mind. Dependencies, can introduce vulnerabilities. Dependencies are constantly updated. So it's just something to keep in mind. First, just to be very cognizant of the dependencies that you're using. You probably want to do a little bit of research to make sure that they are trusted before you just introduce them into your code base all willy-nilly. That's like always something to be aware of. I think whenever I introduce dependencies, I want to look for something that is trusted, that has lots of other downloads, that kind of, has been around for a little bit while. So maybe like at least version 1.0, hopefully. But yeah, I think this can be a big point of failure, I guess is what's coming to mind, or at least just introduce a lot more vulnerabilities and things that can go wrong, especially because these dependencies that you're using, you're typically kind of just trusting that they work. But you have to be really aware that things can go wrong, that can introduce a lot of bad things, perhaps. And I think just another kind of note, just along the same lines of kind of keeping code clean and simple, keeping things up to date, is just to make sure that you don't have any stale code sitting around. You should really take time to kind of like clean up technical debt, refactor your code. I think a lot of teams and projects in general just like don't really do a lot of that, but it can be really beneficial just to like not keep old stuff lying around. I think just old stuff in general in tech and in applications, there can be things that go wrong over time if it's not updated. Leaves more room for attacks. So another tip, it's called the 7, is to store secrets appropriately. So remove anything from your application that is not required. I'm really like thinking here about sensitive data like passwords, account numbers, API keys. You should never hard code values. I think generally speaking, it's probably makes sense not to do this, especially some of those examples like passwords, account numbers, API keys, for example. You should always want to think of a secure way to store those. So if it's in some kind of cloud platform like Azure, for example, you can access those variables through, let's say, an environment variable name and use those in your programs. But hard-coded values are going to be problematic if you can find a way to reveal them in your code, maybe in the comments. So again, maybe you're doing some stuff in the inspector and developer tools to really try to get data. First, you're just going to look for that apparent data. So anything that can't just be like left over, that was an incident. Maybe if it was even testing data, but like it allowed you to get access to some test account or something. That is a possibility, but yeah, so code, comments, and then of course URLs. You probably just don't want to hard code any data in there. So even if it is like account data for that user's account, that logged in user's account, for example, maybe you don't want to just like store all their information in the URL. So that's maybe a little bit different than hard coding data per se, but is to be aware of where like secrets and personal information can be exposed kind of visibly in the application, and think about better ways to do that than just storing it in your code. And I think over the years, like if you use GitHub, for example, and I'm going to assume a lot of people do for their applications, GitHub is really good at kind of looking out for any like secrets that might be stored. And they do a lot of kind of scanning for you, which can just help be more aware of anything like this that can be stored without your knowledge or just without remembering. Cool, let me catch up on a couple of the questions. One of them was, I think about the last slide where I made a call out to kind of cleaning up technical debt. So I can't recall what it means. Can you briefly go over that? So technical debt might just be like, I guess generally speaking, things that need cleaning up. So that can be a number of things, and it probably was other things that I mentioned that can fall into that category, like updating all your dependencies, removing any dependencies that aren't needed anymore, removing any code that's not needed anymore. Maybe there are some like functions that you use from a programming language that are being deprecated. So you need to kind of update the implementation or something. Perhaps, I mean, it can be more things like the performance of the application has gotten very slow over time. Like it takes a long time to fetch all these users from the database or something. You might want to have someone like look into that. So there's all kinds of examples. But basically technical debt is meaning like things that you need to address that can be slowing your team down and like slowing your application down, or even be harmful to your application. A question from Steven, do you recommend using a password vault? And I would say absolutely, I do personally. You'd probably have to be aware of, the password vault that you're using. I think you're giving some examples there like Thycotic, Centrify, HashiCorp, which I'm not super familiar with, I will say. But I do recommend using a password vault. I think that can be helpful. I was going to talk about a password vault in one of the upcoming tips. I think about kind of like usable security, especially like, if you want to be on top of creating really sophisticated passwords that are really long, that have a number of characters and numbers and letters and things like that. I really would recommend a password vault. And I'm not familiar with some of them. I'm a big 1Password user myself. So cool, let's keep going. All right, so next up, tip 8 is really all about verifying everything. I think that this is just probably a good tip in life, I would say, but never trust anything outside of your own application. So this can kind of really like go with some of the previous points that we brought up, even with thinking about, how to store secrets appropriately and reducing attack surface, like anything outside your application. So thinking that's, if 30% of the application is like the code that you write specifically, there is all of these other things like these dependencies, these APIs that you're using that you want to verify. So by verify, I mean that the first thing that I always think of is doing thorough testing of this. So for example, thinking about integration testing. So kind of the integration points between your application and maybe these third-party dependencies or APIs. Is something that you're really going to want to do, just maybe doing specific API testing, regularly, kind of always confirming that, maybe in its own isolated way. So not even an integration test, is really kind of just testing that whatever request that you send to this API, you get kind of the valid response back, or response that you expect. But yeah, I think that is really important, and probably a great way to verify. There's going to be other ways to verify, like outside of maybe writing very explicit tests, and writing a number of tests to confirm all the interaction. There can be like a number of different like scans that you run. We'll get into more specifics again probably later, but I was just mentioning in the last slide, I think like GitHub has this service that can kind of like automatically scan your code for secrets. It can scan your code for any like dependencies or anything. So it's important to think about things like that. Any kind of automated checks that you can do. Of course, integrating with continuous integration is always going to be a great idea, but just you should always be verifying everything. And this is kind of like on a consistent basis, like multiple times a day as kind of your application changes. It's really just important to continue verifying that everything is working as you expect. All right. Having usable security, I think this is kind of an interesting tip, and I'm actually curious, like I'll kind of talk through it, but I'm curious if anyone has kind of other examples that come to mind. But the main idea here is that security shouldn't get in the way of kind of allowing you to do what you need to do. So, high security does not equal hard to use in any way, and you should kind of be considerate of, or be considerate, be thoughtful of all the different types of users that you have using this application. So being mindful of kind of it being usable for all types of different users. But I mean, I guess still wanting to keep your application as secure as possible while maintaining ease of use is really what I'm getting to. So I think the best example that I can think of here were around kind of around passwords, or kind of just like access to applications. So for example, like let's say, if your users need to change their password every 30 days, for example, it should be important just to like give them an easy way to, let's say, generate and save passwords easily. So maybe giving everyone access to a password vault, for example, so that they can easily store, update their passwords from there. So that is one example that I thought about, as well as just like making it, maybe even simpler than even needing a password. So really thinking about, innovations in like fingerprint recognition, eye recognition, facial recognition, things like that. I guess especially I think that this is more important, like as a lot of people have worked from home or outside the office in the past year, making it just really easy to access the network. So things like easy to hop on and connect to the VPN, to set up the VPN. Like, I don't know, I was just thinking of those things that like I've even had problems with. So having usable security, there's probably multiple ways to think about this, but I kind of started by thinking about like access and authentication. But yeah, I'm curious if there are any more examples or thoughts that come to mind here. Like, when have you tried to like, do something but felt like you were held back by security, for example? Just, I'll pose that question. I think I'm taking time to think myself a little bit more about the kind of examples that I've had. Um, but yeah, that's an interesting tip. And I think it's important just to think about like, always keeping your application easy to use, right? People want to use things that are intuitive and like not be stopped and have roadblocks by trying just to, have the system be secure. Like, it shouldn't make it any less intuitive. All right, and I think this is tip number 10. So use multiple factors of authentication. So I think that this is really a good one. And really with authentication, you can think about 3 different factors. So first is something that you have, like a phone, a computer, a badge, maybe to get you into a building. Something that you are, so something that is actually physically a part of you, being able to unlock my phone or something with my finger, being able to use the eye scan, even like your DNA that is uniquely identifiable to you. And then lastly would be something that you know. So this is like your username, your password, maybe your security question answers. Those are all things that, like, generally speaking, only you know about you. So two-factor authentication, 2FA or MFA, multi-factor authentication, is highly encouraged. I think about making sure I'm using MFA for pretty much like every single application that has my personal information. So, I think this is just like a good practice, even for applications that you're not actively working on yourself. But like, seriously, think about it. If you don't have 2FA at least or MFA turned on for a lot of the regular services that you use, especially like your bank accounts, you have to do that. Do that now. So it's always going to be encouraged, but on the other hand, really think about how you can build this in, how really this alone can help your applications really have a high level of confidentiality, especially if you have multi-factor authentication. Like you're pretty much, you're not guaranteed safety at that point, but there's a very, very high chance that your information is absolutely secure, because the only way someone would be getting access to your account is if they have you and like are threatening you, right? And like you need to give them your fingerprint and your phone or something, so that you have your authenticator in there and you can verify. So just basically, this maybe goes back to the layers of defense that we covered earlier. Kind of like the more layers that you can add on here, the better, which makes a lot of sense, especially with authentication. So it's always something good to consider. It's having multiple factors and using them yourself. Turn on MFA for everything. All right, and that is the last tip that I have. So I hope I didn't go too fast. I also hope that like this kind of just got your mind working a little bit more about some of these security fundamentals. Again, some of this might be things that you already consider, things that like already make a lot of sense, but I think that they're a set of highly practical, highly useful tips for any application. So as far as what's next, these are some of the upcoming streams that I'm doing. And we are, again, kind of focus on getting more into tools and practices throughout different cycles of the development process. So I hope that these are going to be a lot more kind of like hands-on, exercise-based sessions where we can think about very specific use cases and kind of how to implement security for these different cycles and phases. But that is about it. So please ask questions if you have them. But yeah, that is all for me as of now. So I do have my contact information up here if you'd like to get in touch. I have my Twitter, my LinkedIn, and my email, which is currently hidden, but I can turn off my face. And yeah, I would also appreciate it if anyone could take a brief survey about this stream. There's the event code that you need to do that. It is pretty much all just like select a number. But yeah, if there's more like specific feedback that you have, if you'd like to chat about AppSec security stuff in more detail, you can feel free to contact me at any of those places. And yeah, that's all I have. Yeah, I do see. Hi, Lisa, Anointed Women 09. If you have a question that you don't want to ask here, yeah, please feel free to reach out. And thanks all again for joining. I hope that you take care and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you join me from today. Cheers.